right, everybody, hello. Welcome to Hackster Café. Typically, this is actually a weekly session of interviews with really cool people doing awesome stuff with technology. And usually we go live on Tuesdays at 10 a.m. Pacific on our YouTube channel. So we can drop a link to that in the chat eventually. But this week we are doing it as part of the Hackster Impact Summit. And my guest is Chris Adams, who is a super cool person I know from years back. He's one of the organizers at climateaction.tech. And the executive director of the Green Web Foundation. I'm very excited to welcome Chris to our stage and get a chance to have an in-depth chat. I think the session says that it goes until pretty late. We're going to go until about 1:25 p.m. Pacific, and we'll be watching the Q&A session for questions. So put your questions in the Q&A. Use the button down below that says Q&A. There's a chat and a Q&A, and I'll be watching the Q&A for questions from you folks, and we'll ask those to Chris as they come up in conversation. And in the meantime, we're just going to share a bunch of really cool resources and stuff with you, and also hear about what climate.action.tech is and what it's like to learn to be part of that group, which I'm personally part of. I think it's really cool. So just waiting for, there we go. Awesome. Hey, Chris.
Ahoy, Alex. Lovely to see you again.
Ahoy, hoy. This is such a pleasure. So I told people that, of course, you're one of the organizers at climateaction.tech and the executive director of the Green Web Foundation. First up, I'd love you to tell us what exactly is climateaction.tech. How do you summarize it?
I think you can describe climateaction.tech as an online community for climate-aware techies who are looking to find ways to incorporate an awareness of climate into their everyday work. So if you do care about kind of climate, there are absolutely steps you can take to kind of go work in a new climate tech startup. And there's an incredible amount of money that's been going into this sector. But for people who are working in their everyday life, just like how Drawdown says that every single job can be a climate job, we kind of are a community to basically kind of live that, I suppose, and really incorporate this into how we work. Because the way I see it, everyone is, we all need to be prepared to actually make some changes like this, and also think more around like more about climate in our everyday. Because, well, if we're going to spend eight hours a day minimum on this kind of stuff, it's useful to like get a bit of knowledge and actually have a somewhat safe space to talk to other people and see what's working at where you work and vice versa. So you can come up with like a better idea of what is the most effective steps that you can really take as basically a relatively professionally mobile technologist.
Yeah, I'd love to, we're going to dig into some of those as we go into our chat, but also I'd love to hear really quickly, how would you summarize the Green Web Foundation?
Okay, the Green Web Foundation is based pretty much my day job, and it's a non-profit based on that is working towards an entirely fossil-free internet by 2030. Wow. We provide we do this with open data and open source and open culture. We publish a magazine with climateaction.tech called Branch, which is all about kind of the intersection of climate and tech. And we also make it easy for anyone who is trying to understand the environmental impact of tech to move over to this. And I think you're looking at, Branch magazine.
I was looking at the climateaction.tech for a moment, but here we go. And we're also going to talk about Ecosia in a second, which is look for it. But Branch is so interesting to me. Green Web Foundation looking to decarbonize by what year did you say?
2030. Yes. That's what we're working for. Yep.
We want ambitious. How ambitious do you think this is?
To be honest, I think that 2030, an entirely fossil-free internet by 2030 is actually, it's ambitious, but it's actually quite doable. And to be honest, you actually have a lot of the things that make it much more plausible on your side than we did, say, 5 or 10 years ago. Like the economics around renewables are just so much better now. If you think about it, in the last 10 years, we've seen things like solar and wind get more or less like 10 times cheaper in the last 10 years. And you've seen kind of things like oil and gas not get that much cheaper. So we seem to have this idea of basically greener energy becoming roughly 20% cheaper year on year. And that's been going since for the last, like, honestly, 3 or 4 decades. Well, 3 decades at least. So really the economics on our side, as well as basically the moral case and the idea of actually having a much more kind of distributed internet-y kind of energy system that powers pretty much everything we do. So yeah, I think it's actually totally doable. And if we were to do nothing, you could probably see us arriving at this in, say, 2040 to 2045. But we think we can actually go faster, because when it comes to climate, speed is justice. And every year that we delay is a year where we're basically causing avoidable harm, and we can get to a better future more quickly, in my view.
Absolutely. I'm trying to pull up these this information from the World Economic Forum. It is, as you mentioned, it's a moral imperative, but also it's becoming more and more feasible, and also it's becoming sort of the better option for everyone, both on an individual level, like it's going to be cheaper as those other more exploitative materials don't come down in price. It's going to be better on the individual level, as well as like, so it's not just like convincing people to act sort of against, altruistically. It's actually better for everyone, as you're pointing out. I wanted to highlight, you mentioned at the start drawdown, and that's a project drawdown, which could you explain them really quickly? I think they're wonderful.
Drawdown is an organization where initially there was a book that basically was collating lots and lots of projects from lots and lots of scientists to pretty much give you a kind of idea of like the most effective possible climate solutions, to kind of give people an idea that, yeah, we can actually solve this climate problem. And this is in kind of, like basically like on a kind of cost and environmental term, which ones are the most effective. And it was actually really interesting when it was first published, because there are loads of things which you wouldn't have initially thought. So like one of the big climate solutions was essentially just looking at something like refrigeration and stuff, because in many ways, a lot of the time, one of the biggest drivers of emissions has basically been the kind of waste gases from old fridges and things like that. Now, we've heard of things like, say, carbon dioxide as a kind of like global warming gas, or possibly methane, which we might talk about a little bit later, as another very powerful gas. But the stuff inside fridges, as you see here, the fluorinated gases, they're really, really, really powerful, like thousands of times more powerful than CO2 in terms of global warming. And when these things leak from fridges, they basically cause a really, really nasty environmental impact. So they were basically saying, when we moved in the 80s away from, say, CFCs, which are chlorofluorocarbons, to HFCs, which are hydrofluorocarbons, we ended up with basically swapping one problem being solved, which was like the whole ozone layer, to another one, which is these new kinds of coolants, which were really, 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 really bad news climate wise. And this is one thing that people don't really fix right now, but there are now organizations that do work on this, partly as a response to this, because people weren't aware of it. But there's also some other things as well that are really interesting. In fact, there's a company called Tradewater in America, where they basically focus on dealing with these kind of fugitive gases now, to basically stop them causing the amount of damage that they do cause at the moment, actually.
Did you say fugitive gases?
Yes, fugitive gases. This is a bit of a kind of, yeah, I know. So this is an example here. So I think this is a really, really cool company. And as you can see, this is what they do. They, rather than say, like, well, plant a tree and stuff like that, they basically find where the damage is being done and stop it doing more damage. So it's a little bit like plugging a hole, plugging wells and things like that. Because a lot of the time, if you look around, there are lots and lots of sources of basically bad stuff, emissions currently going that are not being plugged, partly because economically people have decided not to do that, or because when someone built something, they decided, well, it's not my problem. And if maybe say let's say you're kind of drilling for gas, for example, if the state hasn't asked you to kind of make sure that you have allocated some money to make sure like a hole is plugged when a gas when you have like somewhere, let's say we're talking about methane or some kind of gas, if it's not actually plugged, it will keep kind of just emitting. And that they basically fix this stuff by getting it plugged or dealing with these gases in lots of ways. So that's one example, but there's some other really cool stuff that I really like. One other thing they said was one of the really effective climate solutions was basically providing better access to education for women and girls, which is just like like that was like top 4, top 5, really, really, really effective. Because when you have this, then you basically, people are able to do totally different things with their lives. They have much better control over when and how they end up having a family, and also in many cases they end up becoming much more educated, so they're able to do different kinds of jobs. There's a whole load of stuff, and I really, really like this because it really kind of speaks to the fact that when we talk about kind of this better, more equitable, more kind of positive world, you can talk about this. And like there's stuff which I think is really, really exciting. But anyway, Drawdown did this. They released this, they made huge waves, and this is a really kind of positive, hopeful view on this. But most recently, they started a new project called, I think it was Drawdown Jobs, where they're basically talking about this
Ooh.
idea that if you are an employee, you work in a company, so you can apply some of these ideas yourself, or they basically provide some guidance on what you can do as a kind of responsible professional to basically maybe tweak how the way that you do work, or for you figure out what to ask for. Because in many cases it may be that you might have a pension, but that might be invested in something like fossil fuels, for example, rather than like renewables, like you said. And there's an argument for maybe not doing that damage, but also you're probably going to have a better pension at the end as well, because if you look at, say, how various kind of, say, renewables companies have been performing over the last, say, 10 years and looking forward, they're going to be growing much, much faster than a lot of other, a lot of previous companies. So yeah,
Absolutely. And the same with investing as well. I couldn't find the Drawdown Jobs site, but I did find, I've had this tab up for Climate Base. There's all these directories coming up, and climateaction.tech actually has a channel. It's largely based around a Slack community, and there's a channel in there for jobs. So if you want to find, really making your whole life, a lot of people are sort of disillusioned with the work that they're doing, especially if you know that you're working on a web that isn't especially green right now, and looking for, like, if they're transitioning to their next position, there's all this opportunity. There's so many government subsidies and everything available for climate jobs, and as you mentioned, people really are looking for ways to sort of make their day-to-day work count in this way. And so climate base is an option there, and then there's also all these VCs and stuff, who
yeah,
want to fund climate innovation. So really, it's coming back to that idea of it not necessarily
mm,
being altruistic. There's this, you can make it be the things that you work on every day and spend 8 hours
yeah.
on, and also support yourself.
Yeah, so one that I might share with other people that's interesting is climatedraft.org.uk. That's one, sorry, .org. Climatedraft.org is one. And another group that actually they've been funding some of the work that we do, who
Hmm.
I'm a really big fan of. They're called Climate Subac. They are basically an
Oh,
accelerator for nonprofits working with open data and open culture, basically. So if you go to
nice.
subac.org,
I
SUBAK
found it. It's
dot
loading right
org.
now.
Yeah, they're
So
really,
this
really
is the
cool.
other one. This is Climate
Yeah,
Draft. And then if I can get Zoom to let me actually look at the top bar here. There we go. Subac.
yeah. So this is them. I'm really these are the groups that provide some funding to uh our
So
nonprofit
cool.
to help us grow. And there are so many cool projects that these folks do. So there's one called Aim High Earth. They provide kind of online training for basically people trying to incorporate kind of climate into their work. There's another organization called Open Climate Fix, who are using like machine learning to do
Ooh.
crazy stuff like make the grid in the UK more aware of, say, things like how clouds are moving, so they can basically not rely on so many really, really dirty kind of gas-fired power stations, and just make the grid more responsive to this, so without needing this. And they're able, and there are other groups that do really, really cool stuff. There's another one called Autonomy. They are kind of policy house, and they talk about like the climate benefits of a 4-day work week as well. There's loads of
Ooh.
really, really cool stuff inside this. And these folks here, their entire job is to find people who are working in non-profits or things like that, and help them get better at using digital tools, or help them develop some kind of organizational maturity so they're able to raise more funding and scale their impact. And I'm a really, really big fan of their stuff, because
Ooh.
they'll give you some funding,
Yeah,
and
these
the
guys.
idea is that
These guys.
you, in addition to be doing, you join this group, and there is some funding, but you need to commit that any data that you create, or any insights you learn, you put into a kind of shared data cooperative that
Oh,
anyone can use. So you
yes.
create like a kind of public commons of useful information that other people are able to use and inform policy or do stuff like that. They're
Oh, this
really,
is
really, really
wonderful.
cool. It's super inspiring. And like I found out about them through actually climateaction.tech, which is why I like having this space. In fact, there's a number of kind of spin-off and different groups from the stuff we've been doing in climate action tech that has been quite helpful.
Yeah, so one huge thing about this is that we have lots of people collecting data, and I was pulling up some other resources for people who want to do specifically air and water data. And when you're looking at citizen science being one of the hot words here, the phrases, there's so many different databases, and it can be hard to keep track of. But also sometimes people are just like, another NASA page was just like, collect data about water and you'll help. And I'm like, okay, what do I do with those data? And so there's options where there's this air sensor toolbox from the EPA. We've got Purple Air, which is sort of a private group with their own sensors that you can do. We've got Ribbit Network, and then of course there's all these different ones. And so it's important, I guess, to like know where you're putting the data and making it accessible. So I love that Subak has like all these different ones in one place that you can contribute to and know that it's actually going to be used, instead of just being like, I'm throwing my data into the void. Is it going to be helpful? I don't know.
Yeah. There's another organization, if it's a US audience, I would look at citizenscience.gov, because we've actually seen some, from my view, some really kind of interesting work and interesting developments from a kind of like policy point of view, where you'll basically see a lot of like basically funding and work going into things like citizen science from a kind of government level now. You see things like this in Europe. So Europe has had there's like reports and things which have basically said this is the role that citizen science can help play in both helping with engagement, but also creating data sets that are typically quite difficult to actually get, that may inform policy decisions to basically make sure that, say, community benefits accrue more locally, or make sure that, say, maybe if citizens are basically if they have legitimate complaints about air quality and stuff like that, they're able to use this to say, well, can we please have something done about this, because everyone should have rights to kind of clean air and clean water. And like we've seen, there are precedents that were set in, say, both Europe but also in America with the whole kind of Clean Air Act in the 1950s. Like there is a real kind of set of ideas that have come from this. And the thing that I think is probably interesting that I didn't know about so recently is, I guess it's the Environmental Justice Office being set up in the last, say, month or so, actually.
Oh.
Which was really, this is one thing with, in America, there has been this massive Inflation Reduction Act kind of bill that was passed. One of the key things was making sure that a significant part of that goes towards groups who have typically been classed as, say, fence line or frontline communities, who have typically had to face the worst of air quality, or had to deal with all kinds of issues related to like poor environment. And they basically said, no, we're going to actually we're going to put a significant amount of funding and effort to actually righting these wrongs and making sure that people in all these affected communities get a better chance at actually kind of basically getting on with their lives and being free from the kind of nasty stuff that you get from basically the excesses in many ways of, say, industry or chemical waste or stuff like that. So this is stuff I think it's really, really positive, and it's really nice to actually see this finally being getting a real degree of like attention and resources and time coming from from governments which we and putting money towards it, I think.
It's really wonderful. And as of course, all the open data that we're gathering and putting into these databases does really have a direct effect on people's ability to argue for this type of policies. It's really that sort of collaboration between different segments of society, people who are working on technology, people who are funding technology, people who are using technology to gather data for citizen science, and then legislators and aides and advisors, even political aides, who type up reports to give to their our elected officials. Those people they can't study everything. They rely on people, who are helping them, compiling reports for them and making giving them advice on what to do based on their positions. And, you know, a really essential component of sort of pushing back against corporate lobbyists who often are not necessarily altruistic in their goals for for legislation. But
Yeah.
I think you've made this really wonderful place at climateaction.tech for people of all different types to mingle. And one of the really cool things that you do is this climate coffee. Could you tell us a bit more about the structure and the different ways that parts of the community that you've built up? There's the Slack community, there's also a database online, and then there's also these events, and how that all works together to sort of bring people in and keep the community vibrant and useful.
Yeah, so there's a few things that we've been doing, and we basically back in 2018, I lived in I'd moved to Berlin from London, and when I was in the UK, I had joined and set up and like run various meetup groups for techies who want to do stuff in climate, and then we did some of the similar things in Berlin. And the thing I found was that I actually missed a lot of the people in London and that kind of scene there, and I also felt like, well, it'd be really nice to like not be geographically restricted. And I actually found out about a group of some folks in New York who ran this website called climateaction.tech, and I thought, oh, that
Yeah.
sounds kind of cool. I sent them an email, I said, hi, I really like what you're doing, and uh, is there a chance we could maybe work together? And I got chatting with him, and back then it was largely just a group of New Yorkers, maybe 70 people inside a community who were working in various tech firms, and they were essentially trying to figure out what to do. And I joined the group, and then we decided, well, let's try and find a way to make this a little bit more open for people, because maybe there are people outside of New York or London or Berlin or so on. And we basically decided to make it open, but the way that we did this, we set up a kind of like we had a kind of throttle process. So rather than just being able to jump in straight away, we set something up so that when you were to join, you basically had a chance to kind of say a little bit about yourself, and then every Monday we would send a bunch of invites to gradually let people come into the community. This made it easier for us to kind of welcome people because everyone comes in at more or less the same time, or at least on the same day. But also, this was a really, really effective way to get rid of a lot of spam, because one of the things you find with online communities is it's just basically people people will be people on the internet, and when you make it really,
Yes.
really easy to jump in straight in, then you can get like people kind of you can end up with like a less friendly community. So with the idea of just having this kind of break system, it really helped to basically, for folks who want to come in and basically, yeah, isn't it great that we're kind of smashing up the climate, for example, stuff like that, they would usually get bored waiting, and then they wouldn't come in, and it meant that we end up with a kind of really nice supportive group. And
Yes.
so that grew, and then that also meant that when people came in, we could have things like, say, have an onboarding call, or we could stage some of the next things to actually do. So like, hi, here's how to introduce yourself, here's what to do, these are the places that are looking for jobs, these are the people who may be a few months further along than you might be if you're first kind of trying to engage with climate for the first time, and these are some of the resources that they found useful and they have shared. All right, so there's stuff like that we did, and it started with about 70 people, and now I think we're close to 7,000 members now. So, and that was since
Wow.
2018. So that's a relatively fast. I mean, we were not expecting it to grow that large. And when it passed 1,000, we're like, oh my God, this is amazing. So to get to 7,000 was was pretty cool, actually.
And there's all these cool other initiatives coming up, so many different projects happening. Yeah, I've seen various communities sort of start and end up just being sort of a hollow chamber where there's no one actually doing anything, but it's really taken off and become this really vibrant community. I love it. And as I mentioned, there's that jobs page. In the chat, we have people asking, is there a place where all these websites are going to be in one place? So many great companies, I'm lost. And it's a good problem that I'm also having. Fortunately, I've got them all up in tabs on my computer, and we will be sharing these after the fact. Don't worry. A great few places to start are climateaction.tech, that's literally the URL, or look up Project Drawdown, which is another one, and of course the Green Web Foundation, which is the other one that Chris is part of. Oh, let's see. So on this site, we are in largely a hardware developer oriented community, and climate-action.tech has 4 main focus areas. We've got business, culture, and behavior change, green software engineering, obviously, and we'll touch on that later, because a lot of the Internet of Things, IoT stuff that people are building does interact strongly with greener web dev, and then even just, obviously on the devices themselves, there's a lot you can do with software engineering, even to make the devices more optimized for low power and things like that. Sustainable product design, I think, and low carbon infrastructure are 2 of the main ways that hardware technical people have a lot of opportunity to get involved. And you were talking about some of our favorite projects, including Fairphone and Framework, which we talked about a little bit on the site before, but we've got lots of new people here, so let's dig into those a little.
Yeah, so I'm a big fan of Fairphone, and Fairphone is actually interesting. You can think of them as a little bit like a kind of fair trade smartphone. That's like the way that I've kind of thought about it with other people, right? And they were actually set up not as a kind of startup to kind of make a bunch of money. It was actually a group of service designers who said, well, it's kind of ridiculous that there is this massive kind of supply chain of, in many ways, misery going behind a lot of the electronics that we build, right? And they were saying, surely there's got to be another way to fix this. And they started speaking to various manufacturers, and they were like, nah, sorry, can't be done. Can't do anything about it. And as the story goes, they're like, well, this is crazy. Why wouldn't we, we're sure we can make a difference on this. So they tried making a phone themselves, largely to prove other people wrong that you can do this, right? And they're not necessarily, none of them were like manufacturers. So they found like one of the off-the-shelf devices. And then they started looking at the supply chain associated with that, where the different minerals and things come from. And they started making really real commitments to show that, okay, we're going to source like the tin and the gold from very specific places, and we're going to really pay attention to this. And we're also going to think about the full life cycle of a phone like this to see, well, what can you do about a phone about the design that maybe forces an upgrade that doesn't need to happen straight away, and so on. And they started doing a bunch of this stuff. And they also, as one of the ways to kind of increase the longevity of the phone, they did things like, well, we're going to work on having as open as possible hardware and software up and down the stack. So they were looking for a bunch of stuff like this. And they basically had one version of a Fairphone. And to be honest, I bought the first Fairphone. It was very much a kind of, you bought the idea rather than the product, basically. Right. Fairphone 2 was quite a bit better. And then they've been subsequently they've been doing this, and they're now at like Fairphone 4, so basically up to run through this. But one of the things that's really interesting is, because they've shown that this is possible, they're a tiny organization in the Netherlands. They've basically kind of called the bluff on every single other larger organization that says, oh, we can't possibly do this and run a company. And you can very much see them proving that it can be done was a real driver for larger organizations to really up their game. And I think you can see this with very large companies really talking about this, about how sustainable their technology was in a way they weren't before, partly because a small group of people have made dedicated people have just essentially proven that it can be done. And if a tiny NGO or a tiny group with almost no money can do this, then essentially like a $1 trillion company really should be able to do this, right?
They can do it, and they can do it affordably and make it something that's actually accessible to people.
Yeah,
a sustainable company. Also, I love that just a couple other things about what they're doing. They do have the Fairphone 4, but they're still marketing the Fairphone 3. You can get refurbished versions. And also you can get spare parts to fix them. And also they're pioneering another one, I forget what it's called exactly, Fairphone Easy or something, where you basically rent a phone from them for a certain amount of time, and then you send it back to them, get the new one. But that one you're using is refurbished and sent to someone else. And so it's making the tech more accessible further down the line, and also like keeping it out of the waste stream. So much good stuff.
So this is like interesting because, I mean, the technical term is like a product service system. So rather than the idea of actually having a device, I mean, most of the time, I want use of the phone, not necessarily the phone, right? And if you think about, okay, if you lose a phone, you might get a new one, then you load everything into it. It's as if you had the previous phone anyway, right? So
Mm.
if you focus on the actual utility you get from this, then you can end up changing the incentives for the actual hardware you do have. So this is like as we're seeing here, they basically say, well, if you focus on this, then it means that you have if, for example, the people who are making devices, if they are responsible for getting this stuff back, then they can make that, if they can reduce the costs of actually getting something out, then getting it back, and if they're able to increase the the longevity of all those parts, then it helps their bottom line basically. So you kind of, and there are organizations that have done stuff like this in automotive and with aviation, but this is the first time I've seen it with electronics specifically, and I think it's a really, really cool idea because while there are absolutely people who would like to hold on to a phone and will basically make the argument that if you can't fix it or do anything yourself, then you don't own it. There are also lots of people who will basically just say, well, I get that I can fix it if I want to, but I quite like the idea of knowing that if something is broken, I can have something delivered to me the following day straight away, and I can have it loaded back in. And I know that at the end of it, rather than me feeling kind of guilty about putting it in some parts drawer, I know that it's actually being put, the various tools and the various parts are being recirculated or put to a better use in other places.
I
So I think it's a really
absolutely
cool
have a
idea.
couple of old phones
Yeah.
in a parts drawer, which
Right?
I totally will fix. But as you
Yeah.
mentioned, there's a security in knowing that, like, it's almost like being a renter versus owning
Mm-hmm.
a living place. It's something that you rely on for your daily
Mm.
life. And so knowing that, like, you don't necessarily have to, there's a difference between I'll learn how to fix these things, and if it's like a game
Mm.
console or something, then it's like it's okay if it sits around for a while. But you really want to be sure of those skills if you're relying on it for your job, for your relationships, for taking care of people, and all that good stuff.
Yeah. There was
um,
one thing that I was just going to touch on with the Fairphone that I think really interesting was that
mm,
they had been pushing for this idea of a really, really long-lived phone. I think they started down this campaign of a 10-year-long phone,
wow,
this idea. And one of the ways that they've been talking about this is decomposing a phone into kind of modular parts.
absolutely.
Eh, so it's a little bit like, the ship of Theseus, the idea that if
Mhm.
you can change parts of it, then it's still technically they were taking that approach. So when one thing they did recently was they basically said, rather than say launch an entirely new phone, for example, they just said, well, look, we're just going to launch a new camera, so you can just buy the camera, right? And then if you we'll send you a package to get something sent back, and
Mm,
therefore by doing that, most of the energy has gone into like the system on a chip and the screen and everything like that. And it's the thing, like it's like the camera that might be the thing that you're so excited about. They've kind of change this model so you don't have to upgrade the entire device for this. That's very, very different to lots of other large companies or large phones. So this is actually, like, in my view, quite an interesting innovation. And this is very similar to what you've seen with Framework, which is another example of this kind
yes,
of
and actually,
decomposition of stuff. Yeah.
and as we move into that, I'd actually love to mention another one just to sort of slide us over.
Mm,
Framework is an open source laptop that is modular. There's also the MNT Research
yeah.
Reform laptop, and I just wanted to mention this because you talked earlier about having the company itself be
Mm,
responsible for the life cycle of its devices. And it turns out when I interviewed a person from MNT before, he
mm.
Lucas Hartmann, he said
Yeah.
that in Germany there's actually a law that if I'm not sure what all products it covers,
Mm,
but you have to, as a company, accept returns of your products and be able to recycle them, like handle the recycling of them yourself. So for e-waste and things like that, you would just send your phone back to the company. And so M&T does this. And these are two open source sort of modular laptops that I would love to, yeah, let's talk about Framework.
yeah. So Framework takes this idea of a modular device and like really runs with it for essentially laptops, the things that we would use. Now, the thing that's I think is quite cool is you might not be able to see it on here, but you know how like you might have a laptop which doesn't quite have the ports you actually need. They've realized that a lot of the time you might care about the laptop, and if you're old enough, the whole notion of being able to like upgrade maybe a CPU or upgrade a piece of RAM is like it's maybe a long forgotten idea where people glue things in now.
Well,
But
gamers,
they've
gamers
yeah,
are still keeping alive.
Yeah, okay, good, right? So, but it tends to be much rarer in laptops. So this has been this
Definitely.
is an example of saying, well, actually, you can make a device that looks nice, that can be user serviceable and user upgradable. And I think, yeah, this is the middle picture is probably a good example. You can
Yes.
actually see maybe like an HDMI kind of cable or a USB thing. Each of these is a quick release kind of port. So you can just swap out maybe two USBs and plug in an HDMI thing if that's the thing you prefer to use. And they have it broken, set
Yeah.
up like this so that over time, if your needs change, you just change the small parts rather than the entire machine. And I really, really like this approach because when you look at electronics, because electronics are actually pretty efficient now, the majority of the environmental impact will come from the manufacturing part because it takes a huge amount of energy to kind of take sand and turn it, heat up to about a bajillion degrees and turn it into silicon chips and all the stuff like that.
Mhm.
So until we find a way to do that without, in a very, very kind of fossil-free, low-carbon way, there will be this unavoidable impact. So one of the things you can do is basically extend the lifetime of electronics that way.
Yeah, we have a comment from Constantine who says a
Mm,
lifetime warranty would be fair, referring to the
yes.
Fairphone. And I'm sure that in that case, it would you'd have to charge more for it probably,
Hmm.
but maybe they could get like with the subscription model,
Mm,
you basically do have sort of a warranty where they'll like replace it for you and then refurbish your phone. It's like a
mm,
transitivity of repair of warranty. Another aspect that actually this kind of overlaps,
mhm,
you're mentioning the manufacturing of the product itself being part of its impact. And this is one of the, of course, the common critiques of electric vehicles right now is that like, yes, it produces fewer emissions on the road, but like to get to that point, you have to manufacture batteries and things and all this good stuff. And those also can use conflict
mm,
mining. And it's funny because it's not funny, but it's interesting that you sent me this link to lithium iron phosphate site for powering Raspberry Pis, which I
mm,
apparently was on crowd supply, but I missed it. This is another thing that the MNT, I'm not a shill for them, I just think they're really cool.
mhm,
They're using these lithium iron phosphate batteries,
mhm,
which use fewer conflict minerals, no cobalts, for example.
mhm,
Lithium is still iffy, but they're using these exact types of batteries in the laptop, just a bunch of 18650s. I think it's a bank of 18650s
mm.
lithium iron phosphate batteries, and they have like I think fewer cycles available or something, but they hold their more charge. I could be wrong on that, but anyway, really interesting battery technology. So could you tell us about this?
So yeah, I think I shared this because there's a person, his website is scott.ee. I think his name is
Mm,
Scott Webb, and he wrote a little bit a post about making an entirely solar powered website. Yeah, you got it right in front of you here,
yeah.
talking about some of this stuff here, and like running a Raspberry Pi on this, with the idea being that you could run a website entirely off grid. The thing I'd probably share about
Oh,
the mineral thing is that a lot of the time when we talk about, say, like conflict minerals and stuff like that, absolutely there's a thing that we should be thinking about there. But things like if you look at where the biggest sources of lithium, like Australia is probably the biggest, has one of the largest places right now.
mm,
And there are lots of places you can get lithium from that aren't necessarily are maybe I should backtrack. You can get lithium from places like the sea and stuff like that, right? There's lots and lots of it. It's not like it's a particularly rare mineral. It's just in many cases, economically, we've gone for
oh.
certain places first, basically. But it's also worth bearing in mind that when you look at the size of, say, markets for minerals that we might consider as like essential for transition. A lot of the time, we don't talk about just the sheer volumes of fossil fuels and things that you would that the alternative are. So if if we're gonna have a conversation about the impact and the kind of environmental and say environmental justice implications of these, we really, really also need to be talking about fossil fuels and what
Mm-hmm.
the default is, because yeah, there is like if you look at the numbers, there's huge amounts of science and showing like that just because you might not see them directly yourself, but
Mm-hmm.
there are things like we know that like literally millions of lives are cut short for by air quality and fossil fuels, which is why we have these air quality kind of projects and citizen science things. Like they're not coming from nowhere, all right? And it's we should totally talk about that. Absolutely. And because these markets are relatively small, there is a much greater chance to actually set some much more equitable and fair defaults from the very beginning, rather than something which is totally set up and has been really problematic for literally hundreds of years. So like this is why I think that, yeah, there are absolutely issues with transition minerals and things like this, but this feels like we have a much greater chance of basically embedding the kind of values that I guess we might be talking about and wanting to actually see passed on to our children and so on from that, rather than, a couple of hundred years of colonialism and stuff like that, I suppose. Yeah.
It is small enough now that, like, I see, to me, it seems like this vast community, and it is, because as mentioned before, there's an overwhelming amount of stuff going on in this space. But at the same time, like, compared to what's going on elsewhere, you're right, we have this great opportunity to sort of like get in on the ground floor of, but in
Yeah.
terms of defining the culture. And what
Yeah.
I see is that a lot of the people who are concerned with with climate justice, it is climate justice. It's about not only like the environment for it's deeply interlinked between the survival of the species, the survival of other species, the way that we treat the creatures living in our air, in our water. We're not just doing this for humans, and also we're doing this for all humans, where there's this aspect that the people most affected, of course, by climate change right now are people being displaced, people who may end up as climate refugees, and people who live in places where the emissions are being generated, so that people in other places can have electric based or non-emitting electricity and things like that. I don't mean to go on a polemic here, but yeah, they are deeply interlinked, and I think that a lot of the people working in greener tech right now are very aware of that, and it's wonderful that we get to kind of shape how things of the future are built so that they're not just better for the earth, but also everyone on it. We have a question from Chanel Wu, who says, do you know how the energy usage of the manufacturing processes, e.g. refining the silicon, making lithium batteries, roughly compares to the energy used in transporting the materials, shipping the minerals from the mine, getting things to the foundry? That's a good question.
Yeah, I think my intuition. Okay, so I need to say that I'm not an expert in this. This is not my area of specialization. I would refer to like probably the Colorado School of Mines or Morgan Bazillion or someone like that. These are the names you should probably Google to find out more about this. Or
Could you
there's a
repeat
really
this
cool
really quick?
newsletter. Yeah, Morgan Bazillion, and the
Morgan
Colorado.
Bazillion.
His name is Morgan Bazillion. He's a poet as well as one of the world's like foremost writers about basically these kind of minerals. There's also a really, really cool newsletter called Green Rocks where people talk about some of this stuff. But there's a few other links I'm happy to share which may be useful as well. So this guy here, he is basically someone who's actually, in my view, has a lot to, he basically teaches all about this stuff. So that's one
Nice.
that he's got a lot. There's I've got to find the name of this this other scientist. I forget her name, but I found her stuff really, really useful because she has a really, really strong focus on the kind of environmental justice aspects of this. In fact, there is a podcast. You'll see where it says "Poet of the Low Carbon Transition" here by Michael Liebreich. He runs it's to the right, just a little bit to the
Oh,
right.
here we go.
Yeah, there you are.
Yes.
Yeah. So there is a link I will share with you where this guy Michael
This is
Liebreich,
YouTube.
he runs a
No.
podcast where he talks about this stuff. And one of those, there's another scientist who writes about this, but the more accessible version of this stuff is a kind of newsletter called Green Rocks. It's just a Substack newsletter. I found that quite fun and easy to read, and that's quite, yeah, this is a nice way in, which is kind of manageable. And yeah, this person has been writing about this for a long time, and he
Nice.
provides, goes into a lot of depth, but also it's also extremely readable. The other person I would really Maddie Stone, she's she I found her writing really, really, really easy to read, but also has fantastic depth, and it's just like a really nice turn of phrase. So she's on Twitter as the Mad Stone, and she also runs a newsletter. Yeah, this is her. She writes all about this, and I think she probably has, I think her writing is probably some of the best writing I've ever come across
Wow.
around basically the around all this stuff related to kind of transition materials, where this stuff comes from. And she has a really, really cool newsletter called The Science of Fiction, which is also a lot of fun. So yeah, I cannot recommend it, her writing enough. I am such a big fan.
Oh, nice. Oh, so many links. Again, we will be putting
Yes,
a list of all these links at
but
the
back
end
to
of
the original
the...
question.
Oh,
Yeah,
yes.
yeah. Oh yeah, so we've yeah, so Chanel, I think your question was about the energy. Where is most of the impact? I suspect the impact is actually the crushing of the rocks and refining of the minerals rather than the transportation of the minerals. Because I mean that's because I think yeah, that's what I'd actually say. But this is another fun fact, right? You know, transportation, when we're talking about moving these things around. Let's say we talk about fossil fuels for a second, right? 40% of shipping is just moving fuel around to get it
Wow.
burned, right? So like if we didn't have fossil fuels, then that's like half of our shipping, half of the emissions, which is like 1% of global emissions, which is basically, I don't know, that's you know, half of all of aviation, or half of the internet, right? That's gone. That's basically that's like removing the environmental impact of a country, of actually of the UK, right? So like imagine like that, you know, a country of 60 to 70 million people just no longer needing to be there because we're not moving things around like that. It's like,
Wow.
yeah, this is like because the thing that I think a lot of time we forget about is this idea that, well, because you have to keep, if you're going to be relying on, say, burning fossil fuels, yeah, you need a steady supply of fuel continually as your source of energy. Whereas if you're like able to kind of just harvest energy from natural cycles of the world, like sun and wind,
You don't
then
need to truck in
you
sunlight
can,
from anywhere.
yeah, exactly, yeah.
Even I was reading a blog post. It might have been one of these ones actually from Scott, where talking about living in Sweden and how they had famously 5 weeks with no sun. I'm not sure if it was his blog post or a different one, but how, you know, there are, yes, it was. Here we go. So this is that same Scott Evans
Yeah.
blog post we were looking at with the lithium iron phosphate
Hmm.
batteries powering a solar powered Raspberry Pi website. And this actually, incidentally, is not the first solar powered
Yeah.
website that I've seen, but he mentions how moving to Sweden, moving to full-time solar hosting wouldn't necessarily be possible. But you know, even so, there's options that don't involve trucking
Mm.
fuel everywhere, like you're talking about.
Yeah, I mean, this is actually, we could talk a little, I mean, we could go in two directions from here. If we can talk about solar and solar websites, it's all, you know, this phrase, it's always sunny somewhere. There is like
Oh.
there is a project called the Solar Protocol, which literally takes advantage of this idea. And rather than having, if you have maybe a network of people who have agreed to host each other's websites,
Oh,
then because
yes.
it's always sunny somewhere, you could just serve the website from wherever it's sunny. And that's literally what the Solar Protocol does. They have a bunch of networked Raspberry Pis all around the world, and they serve various websites. And when you go to the Solar Protocol website, the website will be served from whichever of those Raspberry Pis has the most battery and has been charged from the sun the most, basically. So as
Wow.
the you know, as the world turns, you have different places like passing this relay of websites around. It's a
That is so
really, really, really
cool.
cool idea, and like this is an entirely open source project. They ran a hack day, I think, a couple of months back about this, and this is how I found out that actually this is, if you've ever worked with maybe a server and you've used something like Apache, that's essentially what they're using under the hood. So this is the stuff that I think is, you know, this is where I think that the internet could actually be going. This idea of an internet which is
Yes.
aware of the carbon intensity of the world, and where you are able to serve things from the greenest possible place. And this is actually some of the work that we've been doing with the Green Web Foundation. And if this is interesting to you, there's a podcast where we dive right into this stuff with a bunch of kind of green web boffins at an organization
For
called
Americans
uh,
and others who don't
yeah,
know that word, it means scholars.
sorry, yeah.
Eggheads.
Yeah,
So you were saying that you have a podcast or something?
Yes, so I've been co-host. So this is another project that came out of climateaction.tech. One of the organizers was a guy called Asim Hussein. He is now the chair of the Green Software Foundation,
Oh.
which is a larger industry body, which is basically comprised of large companies like, say, Intel, ThoughtWorks, Microsoft, us. We're one of the founding members, the Green Web Foundation, that is. And this is kind of like, you can think of this is a project that kind of graduated from the climate action tech stuff. So this stuff here, they have this actually that's really, oh yeah, I forgot all about the carbon hack. So they have this,
look at the top of the screen, everybody.
yeah,
The 13th of
it
October
starts
to the 10th
tomorrow.
of,
Yeah,
starts tomorrow. Carbon
it
Hack
starts
2022.
tomorrow. Yeah, they have a
One
whack.
day.
Yeah, so this is the month-long hack day. Sorry,
Cool.
month-long hackathon where they have it like quite a substantial amount of prize money available for people to start building the kind of carbon aware stuff that I just told you about now with things like solar protocol and stuff. There's something of like between $90,000 to $100,000 in prize money for various projects to incorporate these ideas, and they've even got an open source set of libraries and tools that you can use and play with and form a team to like compete with other people, or even just like share the stuff that you do have. Anyway, the reason I was saying that is this is one of the things that came out of climateaction.tech, but also there's a podcast called Environment Variables, which is
That's very
yes,
good.
and we
It's gonna be
have
horrible to Google for. Let me see. Oh no, here we go.
yeah, just podcast.greensoftware.foundation.
Oh, go to that one.
Yeah, so this is the podcast that I've been co-hosting with various other people, and most recently we've been doing deep dives with aforementioned boffins and industry specialists to talk about different aspects of, okay, well, how do you build like greener digital tools? So I think if we scroll down, you might see there was one about green networks, where we talked about basically, this is when we spoke to some people from various like universities, let's say Zurich in Switzerland, and people from say Intel and in America, where they've been writing all these papers about, okay, this is how you can do stuff where you have like an internet that knows when it's green and where the energy is green. So you could actually route based on the greenest possible routes around like the internet, right? There's
This is
stuff
very
like that.
exciting for me. I was actually
Yeah.
looking at building a Raspberry Pi that would be solar powered and would serve an IPFS website,
Yeah,
which, you know, is the same idea. It's decentralized, it's distributed, you can host from anywhere. Anyone can have their own node that provides the same website. So if it goes down somewhere, you know, it's used to mirror Wikipedia in places where they've blocked it and stuff. Wonderful. But this is basically that, but in a box already. Also, I feel like this would appeal to the Web3 people who are like, decentralized web. Yes. But also bringing in the idea of like you said, it's always sunny somewhere. You can pick the source that has the most energy. That's so brilliant.
Yeah, there is some really nice stuff. There is also some, while we're on this subject actually, so by all means look through that podcast. There's loads of really like super nerdy stuff where you dive into all these things. So there's plenty there, but also the thing I was going to draw your attention to was, I think is the the Internet Islands project, which I think is really inspiring and really interesting. This is basically this idea of taking things like a Raspberry Pi or a very small server in a distributed way, and then basically loading up all of the kind of what we might consider like the the dividends of society, I suppose, like all the surplus, this kind of cognitive surplus that we've been using to kind of create things like, say, Wikipedia or various other openly accessible public pieces of information. The idea of like an internet island is a solar powered server which is preloaded with all of Wikipedia, all of the things like, say, from the Khan Academy that are publicly licensed, all this learning and teaching, all this stuff here. Yeah, this is the one. Yeah.
And you see this kind of in prepper communities where it's like, oh, how to rebuild a civilization from scratch, how to like build a fire, how to get clean water and things like that. But also you could have it for all kinds of, we interviewed, oh my goodness, names escape me, but this really cool artist, Julian Oliver, who made the Pink Cell Tower, which contains serves from a Raspberry Pi, its own plans for how to replicate it and stuff like that. But this could be anything.
Oh, I didn't know Julian did that. That's really cool.
Yeah,
Wow,
it does all kinds of other stuff too. It's very cool.
Really? Oh, okay. I've got stuff to Google myself in that case.
I'll send you the link.
So this is I found out about this maybe 2 years ago or 2 or 3 years ago, and there are other projects which are related to this. But I think this is actually a really interesting idea because they talk about, okay, here's how you build this and here's what they've done. And if you scroll a little bit further down, you'll see all this kind of open free software that and
Oh,
knowledge
I
that
know
is
the
kind of
Pipe
loaded
Juice
onto this. Yeah.
solar panels there. Those are really good.
If you go down a little bit further, you'll see, keep
Mhm.
going all the way down.
Going into
I think
play.
they
Oh,
list all the, yeah, this is it. Yeah, Rachel, this is what it is. So all this stuff is like freely
wow.
available, right? So there's like all stuff about medicine, about all the topics that have been covered in Khan Academy that you can download and just use, right? So that's like, well, algebra, geography, chemistry, all this stuff here. That's just
Mm.
universally available, right? This is just like I think this is like, in my view, this is like delivering on the promise of, like, you know, when Tim Berners-Lee, Tim BL is Timble, but when he in the like in the London Olympics, when he's doing this, when he's in that, he's like, this is for everyone, talking about the web. This is what this stuff feels like. Like, we can absolutely provide this stuff to lots of people, and you can totally imagine a scenario where you could make this you could make this like cheap and easily available, so that when people, if their first exposure to the internet was something like this, I think this is like really transformative. Like, there are,
Mm.
you know, you don't necessarily need to have like an entirely an internet which is basically dependent on advertising to make this stuff available, because some of this stuff is already freely available and you could do so much with it. So
Yeah.
yeah, this is like what this is the stuff that we are really excited about with the Greenwood Foundation, and the idea that, well,
Oh,
everyone should have access to this kind of stuff, and
you know,
we should be able to create like green, meaningful, universal access to this kind of stuff, because yeah, it gives people the chance to kind of unlock all the kind of potential that otherwise they wouldn't have been able to have access to.
yes.
Yeah.
And I swear there used to be a project like this where you could download it all into an old Kindle that you jailbroken, but I can never find it again. There's two more things that I'd love us to, we're almost at
Yes.
time here. We've got to
Yeah.
wrap up, but we have a little bit of wiggle room. And
Hmm.
first up, just really quick, Ecosia, you're a
Yeah.
fan of this one. And also I want to talk about onboarding people, because that's like a huge
Yeah.
thing. It's sort of what we're doing right now, which is like, here's a bunch of a completely intimidating amount of information. Where do you start? And we'll dig into that. But first, really
Mm.
quick, Ecosia. Speaking of
Ecosia is
paperclip.
so you can think of Ecosia as basically a search engine that is designed specifically to make it easier for you to take kind of sustainable decisions. All right. You can see, like, every single time you search the web, right, you can see, rather than like, when you click on a link and stuff like that, like most search engines, they make a little bit of money, right? But what they do with, rather than returning all those profits to a bunch of shareholders who are already, in many cases, probably doing okay, they basically are really reallocating that to continuing to build this or do more kind of interesting sustainability projects. So the entire project is one of the things they do is basically work to reforest degraded land all around the world, but they also fund really interesting stuff to help people make more kind of conscious decisions about where they might be buying things from, or where they might find out how to kind of engage with society on a kind of civil level. So they're doing some really interesting stuff now of, say, when you do like look up particular search results, you'll basically see maybe a company's like Climate Records, how, if everyone acts like this company, where, would we be okay, or would we not be okay, or should we, how do you grade them and stuff like that? And this is stuff which is information from the IPCC, or like in like quite in it's basically like trustworthy, independent, neutral information that they're using here as a way to basically cut through some of the greenwash stuff that is increasingly common around, well, like, I guess, our information ecosystem that we're around. Anyway, I've got to stop because I'm talking a lot, and I realize we've got to make sure we
That's the
make the
whole
most of the
idea.
time we do have. Yeah.
Two really quick things. We
Yes.
have a comment from the
Mm.
chat of will anyone ever stop British petroleum from producing a third of the world's CO2 on their offshore oil rigs? And I have a site called green-ee.com for people who are looking to
Ah.
just find a directory of resources for people. It needs an
Mhm.
update. More on that later, someday. Not now, but anyway, the carbon footprint, of course, was created by British Petroleum to shift the responsibility from themselves onto individuals and be like, it's your job to fix this stuff. No, but also, we get to use this citizen science and stuff to create legislation that means that we can have an effect in that way, like regulating them. There's also drawdown solutions and stuff. The electricity ones, I think, are especially relevant to our community. And onto onboarding. So yeah, where to start? I think drawdown is a great place. You mentioned it right at the start. Hopefully this is going to be one. We've also got this one that I found through climateaction.tech, and I'm curious to know where else you think that someone should start if they want to use their passion for electronics in a way to help our air, water, and other environmental resources.
Okay, I think so actually one of the things that I think is I'll share a link to.
Ooh, yes.
I mean, this stuff I found quite useful. I think there's actually one book that I probably found really helpful. There's a book by a woman called Kimberly Nicholas, Professor Kimberly Nicholas. She has a book called Under the Sky We Make. I've actually found that probably the single most useful book to help me think about orienting myself professionally about this. And she was also quite good on Twitter. She has a newsletter, and she writes about this. Well, basically, as you can see, actual evidence-based stuff, right? This is stuff which is really nice. And like this way of framing it, it's warming, it's us, we're sure it's bad, but we can fix it. I think this is a really helpful way to think about this, because in many cases, no matter what your job is, you will find there are steps that you can actually take, and there's evidence-based stuff that you could be referring to. But going back to your original question, if you are a technologist and you want to think about how to do some of this, the Zopeful thing is a nice way in. The actual climateaction.tech community is one thing that we do. So every week we have these kind of like onboarding calls, and they are facilitated by people who will usually like have a half hour, 1 hour call where people speak to each other about how they feel, what's driving them to kind of think about this more. And then a lot of the time we'll have people who basically say, well, have you heard about this project? Well, you might want to speak to this person. You have someone like one person, Sandra Pellier. She's been doing a bunch of this to basically act as this kind of incredible connector, putting people in touch with either projects or channels in a group that you might want to know about, and so on. And then you often see people sharing back some of the stuff they've learned in the kind of climate action tech cat salons that we have here. So that's one of the things I would point. So the Kimberly Nicholas stuff is really helpful in my book. This stuff here, and
in your book.
one other project which is kind of like affiliated with climate action tech. There's an organization called Terra.do. They provide training and various courses for people who do want to like transition into working on climate much more. And they have a few very specific, well, yeah, I mean, you can see right now what the whole thing is about. They have various courses, some of which for free and some of them which are not free. And I think the stuff that they do is actually really impressive and well thought through. And I think this is actually quite good, because they have a real focus on getting people from other things to work in climate and find out a role or find something to work in specifically. So yeah, this is one thing that I think is actually quite good. The other thing that I would probably point you to as we run up, there's another kind of community where we're we're friendly with, but they're not quite the same as us. They're called Work on Climate. So is it Work on Climate? They're set up by some ex-Googlers, and they have a real strong focus on getting you out of one company and then into a climate job. Nice. And there's a bunch of people who are looking to do that transition. Now, the thing I should share is like what we do is climate action tech is like, if you're working in a company and you want to change where you are right now, that's one thing. But these folks are specifically about, I want to get out of my existing job and I want to move into a climate job. This is what these folks do. And they have I'm really impressed by what they do. And they have a really good community for this. So I would, if you want to jump, you don't want to, you just sort of like jump in with both feet, I would look at this. This is probably an active community who are very much about switching. If you're in your existing community, or you're in your existing role and you're trying to figure out what you can actually do, climateaction.tech might be a little bit better for you. But we're big fans of these folks, and I really, really like what they do. So if you do want to switch entirely, then that's what I would suggest you do. And when what the stuff we do, if we say that, we are quite happy to say, well, if you're looking for that, then this community is really, really awesome for what you might want to do. But if you're not sure you want to jump yet, and you are looking for a kind of cross organizational boundary place where you could speak to other people and see what they're doing, then that's the stuff that we do at climateaction.tech.
ClimateAction.tech, everybody. Yes. Okay. So that was an incredible amount of information, but that's exactly what I love. It's so crunchy and there's so much to dig into. We will be putting links up, all these links. I'll be sharing a one tab page where you can just look at the whole thing at once. It's terrifying and wonderful. Thank you so much, Chris.
No worries,
I feel like we could have
Alex.
gone for like multiple more hours, but you know what? That's what clean coffees are for, and that's what the salons are for. There's all kinds of places for us to all meet up and chat about this stuff. Thank you again, Chris. Such a good time.
Lovely seeing you again.
You too. Miss you.
All right.
Bye.
Take care. Ciao.